Him and the streets of Baku are something that need to be studied. First time since Miami 2023 that he out-qualified and outperformed pretty comprehensively Verstappen. Just seems to be putting himself in the right place at the right time. Hello everybody, my name is Michael and welcome back to Last the First. After an absolutely thrilling Azerbaijan Grand Prix, let's get into my driver ratings. Starting off with the new Constructors' Championship leaders with Oscar Piastri. You've got to give him a 10 out of 10. I think his victory really deserves an 11 out of 10 if anything. He drove extremely well. Didn't put a foot wrong. There was one moment where he did get pretty wide on the exit of the corner before the very long straight, but luckily for him, Leclerc did the same exact thing, which was pretty cool to see them both kind of follow suit with that drift. But yeah, he really needed track position to have a chance of winning, and there was really only one moment where he had that opportunity, and he took full advantage of that and put on an absolutely stellar pass on Leclerc, and because of that, it allowed him to control the race from up front, and he was able to win ahead of Charles Leclerc because of that. Lando Norris, I'm going to give an 8 out of 10. Despite his poor qualifying, he did have a really strong race, coming from 15th to 4th after some of the drivers had to start from the pit lane, and after, of course, Sainz and Perez crashed. But really, his weekend was derailed by the yellow flag. I've been feeling a little bit harsh on Norris, and I'm starting, at least this weekend, and I'm starting to lighten up a little bit because it really was a yellow flag that messed up his qualifying. But nonetheless, I still think overall he really needs to fight back up against Piastri. But either way, he had a really strong race, and despite how good the McLaren has been this year and how well they've been doing, it was still always going to be a challenge for Norris to score some solid points, and he managed to do that. And he even somehow outscored Verstappen. He managed to pass him. I know Verstappen was having some serious struggles with the Red Bull. He definitely was not gelling with it like Perez was. But it was still very impressive for Norris to fight back and get ahead of Max Verstappen. Charles Leclerc seems to do everything right at Baku, but can't quite get that victory. He's had 4 pole positions in a row, and he just missed out on the win just barely again this year. But I'm going to give him a 9.5 out of 10. I mean, he drove an absolutely superb race as well. The only reason I'm knocking him is because he wasn't the one to win, and maybe he had a slight miscalculation by not defending a little harder against Piastri. But, to be fair, it seemed like he had the pace advantage, and it seemed like he would be able to get past Piastri, maybe not easily, but later down in the race. And unfortunately for him, he just wasn't able to. Really, the biggest problem for him came with the warm-up of the hard tires. He lost his whole 6-second advantage when they pitted because the hard tires on the Ferrari, both him and Sainz, just would not warm up to save their lives. So he lost 3 seconds just on his outlap alone, which was pretty bonkers. Without that, I think it would have been a much different story. I think he probably could have controlled the lead, controlled the pace, controlled his tire usage, and then probably wouldn't have had quite that fall off at the end. But nonetheless, those are all what ifs. Really awesome race from Charles Leclerc, so 9.5 out of 10. Carlos Sainz had a surprisingly good weekend. I'm giving him a 7 out of 10, mostly because of his incident with Perez kind of knocks him down a little bit. And I say surprisingly because of his own admission. He typically doesn't do super well around this track. It's not his favorite track, but he did manage to qualify P3, which was really awesome for him. Unfortunately, right off the beginning of the race, he lost a position to Perez, so from then on, he was kind of stuck behind him. But generally, the top 3 just had a bit more pace than him. Really, Piastri and Leclerc battling, and then Leclerc's tire fall off is really what brought Sainz back into the fold of things. How without that, it seemed like he was a bit of a long outside shot of a podium, but it was still a strong race overall for him. Once again, just some points deducting for him because of his collision with Perez. I think generally it was a racing incident, but I would say that Sainz did veer over a bit further than what Perez did. So if we had to portion some blame, I would put it on Sainz, but overall, I think it was really just a racing incident. Russell had a pretty solid race. I'm giving him an 8 out of 10. Mercedes are kind of in a weird position right now. I think they're not fully understanding exactly where their car is. They're struggling with inconsistency throughout the stints, throughout a race, throughout a weekend. They're just really having a hard time. It seems like they understand their car a bit better than previously, but they're still, I think, struggling for that next level of understanding. It seems like they did make some breakthroughs, of course, when they were so competitive before the summer break, but they are on a bit of a challenging trajectory right now. But overall, Russell just seems to be putting himself in the right place at the right time, and he's doing what he can with the car that he has, and because of that, it granted him a podium because of the Sainz and Perez collision. Like the incident in Austria, Russell was there to pick up the pieces, and props to him for being there to take it when everybody else was crashing into each other. Hamilton seemed to have quite the breakthrough before the summer break, finally getting that win at the British Grand Prix, and then another win at Spa. But since then, his form has kind of been a little bit shaky. I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10 for the weekend. His qualifying performance have been a bit down as of late, even more so than his usual deficit to Russell this year. And even his race pace, which normally is top tier, has been a little lacking. He didn't seem too comfortable with the car, especially in the race. And he did qualify decent in 7th. However, they decided to take an extra power unit because they were going to need to at some point later on in the year. So that caused him to start from the pit lane. So, of course, it was going to be tough from there. But he didn't really look like he was challenging for any points for most of the race. He just kind of lucked into the points because of that Perez and Sainz incident. So a bit of a challenging weekend for Hamilton. Going to give him a 6 out of 10. A bit disappointing, to be honest. On to Sergio Perez. I had originally given him an 8 out of 10, but thinking about it now as I'm recording, I think I've got to go with a 9 out of 10 despite his collision with Sainz. Him and the streets of Baku are something that need to be studied. Regardless of his terrible form throughout the season, somehow he just absolutely turns it up here, and it was the first time since Miami 2023 that he outqualified and outperformed pretty comprehensively Verstappen. So that was surprising to see, that's for sure. I know he's always excelled well on this track, but for him to be that ahead of Verstappen is definitely surprising. He was on pace from the start of the weekend. He looked like a contender for pole and a contender for the win. And had it not been for his collision with Sainz, he would have been on for at least a podium. So definitely a good result for him. Well, it would have been a good result, but a promising weekend overall for him. In a time where he really needs to show that he deserves to keep a seat for the rest of the season and maybe next year as well. Moving on to Max Verstappen. I'm going to give him, once again, originally I gave him a 7 out of 10, but thinking more about it, I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10, actually. I think he really struggled this weekend, and he really was comprehensively beaten by Sergio Perez, which is not something that happens all the time. But I guess even the Max Verstappens of the world have weekends where they aren't able to maximize the car's potential. The change in floor geometry that Red Bull did does seem to help, has seemed to help them a decent bit. But for some reason, Perez was just gelling a lot more with the car. From my understanding, it is a bit more understeery now, which favors Perez. And if it's to a certain point, Verstappen has a bit more of a hard time with it. But nonetheless, he was still easily beaten by Perez, which is definitely weird. Unfortunately for Verstappen, I think things are going to get a bit tougher before they really start to improve with Singapore right around the corner. Of course, the infamous race last year where Red Bull lost the only race of the entire year. So I think it's going to be a tough weekend out for them next time. Fernando Alonso, I'm going to give an 8 out of 10. He had a really awesome race, a quiet race, kind of all by himself, but he really maximized the car that he had. Aston Martin's kind of in a no man's land right now. They're firmly the 5th fastest team, significantly slower than the top 4, but normally a bit faster than the rest of the midfield. It could be argued that the Williams might have been a little faster even than Aston this weekend, but Alonso really had a really strong race. I think a solid result like that is good for the team. I think they really need a morale boost during these times because they have been struggling so much. They can't seem to develop the car throughout the season, but hopefully between this result as well as the spark of Adrian Newey in the future, that team's going to be back on the up and up. Lance Stroll, I'm going to give a 5 out of 10. I think he had a pretty terrible weekend. He was comprehensively beaten by his teammate in qualifying, which is pretty standard. At the start of the race, he tried to put a move on Tsunoda. To me, from how I view it, I think it was a little bit too optimistic. I think I might be a bit in the minority there. But, Tsunoda could have left a little more room, but I don't know. It didn't seem like Stroll really needed to be putting his nose up there. And because of that, it caused a puncture for himself, took out Tsunoda, and from there his race was really derailed and not much that he could do from there. Eventually, I believe he retired with brake issues. So overall, not the best of weekends for Lance Stroll. The Williams pair were on absolute fire this weekend. Starting off with Alex Albon, I'm giving him a 9.5 out of 10. I mean, he just continues to impress. Everybody has been knowing that he's been on another level last year and this year. But with a seemingly more competitive teammate, he still is winding out on top. I know Franco only has 2 races under his belt, but Albon still had a really strong performance. And I think overall, he's really just continuing to distance himself from his tough history at Red Bull. I hope there is a time that either Williams gets near the sharp end of the grid or he can have a second shot at a top team, because it would be really great to see how he would perform now. Despite the crazy qualifying incidents where they left the cooling fan in the engine cover of the car, which was really crazy, and almost ran over a teammate in the garage as well. Absolute insanity. Despite all that, he still made it into Q3. He did get out-qualified by Colapinto, which was partially Colapinto being on absolute fire, and I think Albon, that whole incident really affected his final run, of course. So yeah, that definitely hurt him in qualifying. But yeah, his and Colapinto's performances are going to be key in the tight constructors battles for the midfield there. Speaking of Franco Colapinto, I've got to go with a 10 out of 10. I mean, he's absolutely exceeding expectations. I know he was beaten by Albon in the race and he was starting to fade a little bit towards the end, but going mostly based off of expectations versus the reality, I've got to go with a 10 out of 10. I mean, I've been quite pleasantly surprised. I knew from the beginning that there would be the chance of more upside to him compared to a Logan Sargent or a Nicholas Latifi, but that potential is much more than I had anticipated, and it's quickly bearing fruit from their decision to swap him with Logan Sargent. It's just really impressive what he was able to do. He's just, despite his crash in FP1, he was just full commitment throughout the weekend, and just really impressive. I'm not sure what else to say other than a great weekend from Colapinto. Ali Behrman, I'm going to give a 9 out of 10. Like Colapinto, he's doing an outstandingly good job for his second outing in F1. I thought he would have a good chance of doing well this weekend because of his previous F1 experience with Ferrari several months ago, and because of his domination in Baku last year. I figured that he would do very well. He did manage to score a point, which is awesome. First driver to score points in his first 2 races with 2 different teams, so that's pretty fun little stat line there. He did come into some luck from the Perez and Sainz collision, but he still had to be there to make it happen. He still had to pass Hülkenberg and be in that position. It didn't seem like Hülkenberg might have been having some issue. He might have incorrectly flick something, switch incorrectly on his steering wheel or something that caused some problems. But nonetheless, Behrman was there and made it happen. So 9 out of 10 for him. Nico Hülkenberg, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. He was on the edge of points contention for most of the race. And like I mentioned, it seemed like he did have some type of struggle, some type of problem, towards the end of the race where he did fall back a little bit. But overall, he wasn't necessarily at his best in qualifying, as he did get out-qualified by Behrman. German. But from my understanding, he said that he doesn't really like this track and he's not very good at it. So maybe that explains some of it. Kind of like Science, not their favorite track. So I'm sure that explains a little bit of it. But overall, not a bad weekend for him, but not his best weekend ever. Pierre Gasly, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. He's been having a quietly strong season. He's just been kind of steady thereabouts, just doing the most out of what that Alpine can offer, despite all the off-track politics at Alpine, the poor on-track performance. He's still been performing at a higher level than his teammate, and really there's not much more that he can do. The car just really isn't typically in points contention, and it's hard to be at Alpine right now. But he had an excellent qualifying result. Unfortunately, he was disqualified for a fuel flow issue. Was that the reason for his high qualifying position? Maybe, potentially. I'm not sure if that would have made that much of a difference. Nonetheless, he fought back in the race, gained some good positions, but unfortunately the car just wasn't there to be able to get in the points. Esteban Ocon, I'm going to give a 6 out of 10. His chances of a good result were hindered by power unit issues, so both Alpines having some struggles there with either reliability or the fuel flow sensor getting disqualified. But once again with him as well, that caused him to start near the back of the grid. And given Alpine's current struggles, it was always going to be tough for Ocon to do much on Sunday, just like with Gasly. However, Gasly did outperform him and did beat him in the race, so that's why I am rating Gasly a bit higher. But yeah, overall, not much that he could do. I'm sure he's definitely looking forward to 2025 when he'll be moving to Haas. Daniel Ricciardo, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. VCarb just once again lacked the pace to do better than where he finished in 13th, which realistically would have been 15th. Every upgrade they've added to the car this year really hasn't worked as expected. It really comes at an unfortunate time for Daniel Ricciardo, as he really needs to show that he deserves to be in F1. I don't know what's going to happen. I believe Helmut Marko recently stated that sometime in the near future here, they will announce who is going to be officially at both teams there, so or at least at VCarb. So, not ideal for Daniel Ricciardo, but overall, he just had a steady race. VCarb are just kind of nowhere. They're kind of lost right now with the new upgrades on the car that they've been bringing. And yeah, he didn't do anything wrong in the race, but he needs big headlining performances to really secure his future. So overall, just a fine weekend for Ricciardo. Yuki Tsunoda, I'm going to give a 6 out of 10. Really hard to judge again this weekend, as he did get taken out on the first lap. So poor Yuki Tsunoda is on a bit of a tough run of luck lately. That's just not ideal for him. He could have given Stroll a bit more space, but I don't think there was too much that he could have done. I think Stroll was generally sticking his nose a bit where he shouldn't have been. But nonetheless, he was taken out, and there was a whole hole in his side pod. So he had to retire the car, and not much more that he could do. Zhou Guanyu, I'm going to give a 7 out of 10. Sauber remains the worst team in F1 despite its grand ambitions as it transitions to Audi in 18 months. Joe has typically been behind Bottas this year. Bottas has been performing way better than him throughout the year, but finally Joe did finish ahead of him despite some engine issues that caused him to start at the back of the grid. Now, it was a battle to be the last driver on the lead lap. It still was a positive result for Joe. I don't think there's much that he can do to save his seat for next year, but it's still good to see him having a good result. Even Valtteri Bottas seems to be on the edges of if he's going to keep that seat next year or not, but we should know in the very near future. Valtteri Bottas, I'm going to give a 6 out of 10, and that's because he was beaten by Zhou Guanyu. He did finish absolutely last amongst the finishers, so that's definitely not ideal for him. And like I mentioned, it's really looking shaky as to if he's going to keep his seat there next year or not. Since Mattia Binotto came in, it seems like he has had a decent shot of keeping that seat because the previous leadership of Andreas Seidel seemed like they didn't want to keep him. But now his chances are maybe shrinking a little bit to stay on the grid between Colapinto absolutely showing up everybody and F2 championship leader Gabriel Bortoleto. both of those two drivers seem to be in contention for that seat. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Bottas really needs to deliver some strong performances to finish out the season. Just unfortunately, this wasn't one of them for him. So those are my driver ratings for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. An excellent, excellent race, and I look forward to having Singapore in just a week's time. And then unfortunately, another summer break like time period off, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. Give us a time to rest and recoup before we finish out the season strong. So thank you all for tuning in. Give me a follow on social media if you're interested. I'm on X as Last to First Real, first spelled F1RST, Instagram as Last to First. You can also find me on all the major podcast mediums like Apple, Spotify, Google. I'm on YouTube with the video podcast. And also I have a blog at lasttofirst.wordpress.com. Once again, first spelled F1RST. So thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time for the Singapore Grand Prix.